Garden Lodge, London, September 1990. Brian May climbed the stairs to Freddie Mercury's bedroom with a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with the music equipment he was carrying. Through the door, he could hear Freddie's labored breathing, a sound that had become the soundtrack to all their recent visits. "Brian, that you, darling?" Freddie's voice was thin, barely recognizable as the instrument that had commanded stadiums. "It's me, Fred." Brian pushed open the door to find his friend and bandmate sitting up in bed, surrounded by pillows and notebooks, his eyes bright with an intensity that his failing body could no longer match. "I finished it," Freddie said, holding up sheets of paper covered in his distinctive handwriting. "The song. Our song. I want to record it this week." Brian's heart sank. Because he'd come here to have the conversation he'd been dreading for months, the conversation that would haunt him for the next 3 decades. "Fred, about the recording session? Don't!" Freddie's voice suddenly had steel in it, a flash of the old Freddie, the one who'd never accepted limitations. "Don't tell me we can't do it." But they couldn't. And Brian was about to break his best friend's heart. March 1990. The band knew Freddie was sick, had known for years really, even when he wouldn't say it explicitly. But he was still recording, still creating, still being Freddie Mercury, with the kind of determination that made death itself seem negotiable. They were working on what would become Innuendo, an album that felt like both a celebration and a farewell. Freddie's voice was noticeably weaker, but he was finding ways to work around it, to use his remaining strength strategically. "I have something else," Freddie told them one afternoon during a break at Metropolis Studios in London. "Something separate from the album. Something just for us." He handed Brian, Roger, and John each a piece of paper with lyrics scrawled across them. No music yet, just words. Brian read his page and felt his throat tighten. These weren't typical Freddie lyrics, no theatrical metaphors, no operatic drama. These were direct, honest, devastating in their simplicity. "You taught me that perfection isn't playing every note correctly. It's playing every note like you mean it. Thank you for showing me that music and mathematics can dance together." "Fred," Brian said quietly, "is this—" "It's my goodbye," Freddie said simply. "To each of you. Individual verses for Brian, Roger, John, then all of us together in the chorus. I want to record it. I want it to exist. I want you to have it after I'm—" He stopped. Couldn't finish the sentence. Roger Taylor, sitting at his drum kit, wiped his eyes roughly with his sleeve. John Deacon stared at his lyrics like they were written in a language he was still learning to read. "We'll record it," Brian promised. Of course we'll record it. It was a promise he wouldn't be able to keep. Over the next 6 months, Freddie's condition worsened faster than anyone had predicted. His voice, that magnificent 4-octave instrument, was failing. Not gradually, but in catastrophic drops. A week of sounding almost normal, then suddenly unable to hold a note for more than a few seconds. The innuendo sessions became increasingly difficult. Freddie would need multiple takes for lines he once would have nailed in one. He'd leave the studio exhausted, sometimes needing help to walk to the car, but he kept mentioning the song, the goodbye song, the one just for them. "Soon," he'd say, "when I'm having a good day, when my voice cooperates." Brian, as the band's unofficial musical director and producer, watched and listened and did calculations that broke his heart. He consulted with sound engineers, tried to figure out if there was any technical way to make it work. The song Freddie had written was ambitious ranges that had always been challenging even at his peak, sustained notes that required breath control he no longer possessed, harmonies that needed power and precision working together. "Can we modify it?" Brian asked David Richards, their longtime engineer. "Change the key? Restructure the melody?" David listened to Freddie's demo, just Freddie at a piano, singing roughly, marking where he wanted the full band arrangement, and shook his head slowly. "Brian, changing it would fundamentally alter what makes it beautiful. It's written specifically for Freddie's voice at full strength, for what he used to be able to do. Modifying it would be like he searched for the right words, like painting over a Rembrandt because the original colors have faded. So what do we do?" "You tell him the truth," David said quietly. "You tell him you can't record it. Not the way he deserves. Not the way it should exist. September 1990. Back in Freddie's bedroom at Garden Lodge. Brian holding recording equipment he knew they wouldn't use. Freddie holding lyrics to a song they wouldn't record. The engineers looked at the arrangement, Brian began, hating every word before he said it. They ran technical analyses. They listened to the demo. And Fred, they don't think we can capture it properly. Your voice right now, it's not strong enough to do justice to what you've written. Silence. Long enough that Brian wondered if Freddie had heard him. I could try, Freddie said finally. Maybe if we do it in sections, record line by line, piece it together. That's not how you work, Brian said gently. You've always said the magic is in the complete performance, the emotional arc. Breaking it into pieces would destroy what makes it special. Then we wait, Freddie said, a slight desperation entering his voice. We wait until I'm stronger, until I'm having a better day. Brian wanted to lie, wanted to say yes, we'll wait, you'll get stronger, we'll record it next month or next year or whenever you're ready. But they'd been friends for 20 years. They'd created Bohemian Rhapsody together, had built something that would outlive them both. And Freddie deserved truth, not comfortable lies. There aren't going to be better days, Brian said, his voice breaking. You know that, I know that. This is as strong as you're going to be, and it's not strong enough for this song. The look on Freddie's face was something Brian would see in his nightmares for decades. Not anger, not even sadness, just acceptance. The final understanding that his voice, the thing that had defined his entire existence, had betrayed him one last time. I understand, Freddie said quietly. He carefully folded the lyrics and set them on his nightstand. Thank you for being honest. Fred, I'm so sorry, don't apologize for telling the truth, Freddie said. That's never been our way. They sat together in silence. Brian wanted to say something profound, something that would ease the pain of this moment. But there were no words adequate to the occasion. The song was my way of saying goodbye properly, Freddie said eventually, of making sure you all knew what you meant to me, specifically, individually, not in some generic tribute or farewell statement. I wanted each of you to hear exactly what you gave me. We know, Fred, Brian said. We don't need a recording to know. But I needed to give it to you, Freddie replied. And now I can't. That's his voice caught. That's the hardest part. Not that I'm dying, but that I can't finish this one last thing. Brian stayed with him until Freddie fell asleep, exhausted from emotion and illness. As he left Garden Lodge that evening, walking past the gardens Freddie had cultivated with such care, Brian made a silent promise. Someday, somehow, I'll find a way to give this song life, even if it takes me the rest of my life to figure out how. Freddie died on a Sunday evening, surrounded by the people who loved him most. Brian wasn't there. Freddie had asked that only his immediate household be present at the very end. But Brian came to Garden Lodge the next morning, devastated and numb. Jim Hutton, Freddie's partner, met him at the door. His eyes were red, his face aged by grief. He left things for all of you, Jim said. Personal items, mementos, and these. He handed Brian an envelope with Brian written in Freddie's handwriting. Inside were 2 items, a photograph of Queen from 1975, all 4 of them laughing at something off camera, young and invincible and full of possibility, and the handwritten lyrics to the song they'd never recorded. On the back of the lyrics, Freddie had written one final note. Bree, I know you feel guilty. Don't. You gave me 20 years of making music that mattered. That's more than most people get in 10 lifetimes. The song wasn't about the recording anyway. It was about making sure you knew. You made the scared immigrant kid from Zanzibar believe he could be extraordinary. That's the real gift. Keep making music, darling. Keep being brilliant. That's how you honor me. Brian sat in his car outside Garden Lodge and cried harder than he'd cried since childhood. Not just for Freddie's death, but for the song they'd never recorded. For the goodbye that would exist only on paper. He took the lyrics home, put them in a safe, and tried to move forward, but the guilt followed him like a shadow. For 3 decades, Brian May carried the weight of that unrecorded song. He told no one about it, not in interviews, not in Queen documentaries, not even to Roger and John in private conversations. The lyrics stayed in his safe. Occasionally, late at night after too much wine and too many memories, he'd take them out and read them, trying to hear Freddie's voice in his head, wondering what the recording would have sounded like. You taught me that perfection isn't playing every note correctly. Brian would sit at his piano and try to compose music to match Freddie's words, but nothing felt right. Nothing captured the emotional weight that Freddie had intended. "You're torturing yourself," his wife Anita told him once, finding him at 3 a.m. with the lyrics spread across the piano. "Freddie forgave you. Why can't you forgive yourself?" "Because I made him a promise," Brian said. "We'll record it," I said. "Of course we'll record it." "And I broke that promise. You couldn't keep it." "There's a difference." "Is there?" Brian asked, "because it doesn't feel different." The guilt manifested in strange ways. Brian threw himself into preserving Queen's legacy remastering albums, overseeing documentaries, ensuring that Freddie's memory remained alive and accurate, as if enough work, enough dedication, could somehow make up for the one thing he couldn't give his friend. In interviews, when journalists asked if there was any unreleased Queen material, Brian would carefully say, "Nothing significant or a few studio experiments, nothing complete," never mentioning the song, never admitting that Freddie's final, most personal work existed only as words on paper. Roger knew something was haunting Brian. "You've been different since Freddie died," he said during a rehearsal for the 2002 Queen plus Paul Rogers tour. "More intense, like you're trying to prove something." "I'm trying to honor him," Brian said. "You honor him every time you play guitar," Roger replied. "You don't have to carry extra weight that Freddie never asked you to carry." But Brian couldn't explain that the weight wasn't something Freddie had given him. It was something he'd picked up himself the moment he told his dying friend that they couldn't record his goodbye. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A university student named Maya Chen, who was working on AI voice modeling for her doctoral thesis in computer science at Imperial College London. Maya had grown up listening to Queen. Freddie Mercury's voice had been the soundtrack to her childhood. Her parents, immigrants from Hong Kong, had played Queen albums constantly, finding in Freddie's story a reflection of their own struggles with identity and belonging. For her research, Maya had developed an AI model that could analyze thousands of hours of recordings and recreate a person's voice with stunning accuracy, not just the sound, but the emotional nuances, the tiny variations that made each voice unique. She demonstrated the technology at an academic conference in 2019, using Freddie Mercury's voice as her primary example. The AI-generated Freddie sang a few bars of Bohemian Rhapsody, and the audience, including several music industry professionals, sat in stunned silence. "That's impossible," one audio engineer said. "That sounds exactly like him." "It is him," Maya explained. "Every vocal choice the AI makes is based on analyzing his actual performances. It's not inventing anything new, it's extrapolating from what existed." Brian May happened to be in attendance at that conference, invited to give a lecture on the physics of his red special guitar. He sat in the back during Maya's presentation, and when he heard Freddie's voice recreated, but undeniably, Freddie, something shifted in his chest. After the presentation, he approached Maya. "What you've created," he said carefully. "Could it handle something more complex? Something that required emotional depth, not just technical accuracy?" "That's what I'm most interested in," Maya said. "The AI doesn't just copy sound, it learns emotional patterns. How Freddie's voice changed when he was singing about love versus loss. How his breath control shifted depending on the emotional content. It can theoretically handle anything." Brian made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. "I have something," he said. "Something that's been waiting 30 years to be heard. Would you be willing to help me?" The project took 2 years. Brian, Maya, and a small team of trusted engineers worked in absolute secrecy. Brian brought the lyrics. Maya brought the technology. Together they brought Freddie's final song to life. The first challenge was composing the music. Brian had Freddie's rough demo, just piano and voice, but it needed the full Queen treatment. Guitars, drums, bass, orchestration. Everything Freddie would have wanted. Brian composed obsessively, spending months getting every note exactly right. When he finally played the complete arrangement for Roger and John, finally sharing the secret he'd carried for 3 decades, both men cried. "This is what he wrote?" Roger asked, reading his verse for the first time. "You taught me that power isn't about hitting hard. It's about knowing when to hold back. Thank you for being the heartbeat when mine was too irregular to trust." He wrote individual verses for each of us, Brian said, his way of saying goodbye, of making sure we knew exactly what we meant to him. John Deacon, who'd retired from music decades earlier, came out of retirement for this one project. "For Freddie," he said simply. "Always for Freddie." The AI recreation of Freddie's voice was extraordinary. Maya had trained it on every Queen recording, every bootleg concert, every interview and documentary footage. The AI understood not just how Freddie sounded, but how he felt when he sang. When they recorded the first complete take, the studio fell silent. Freddie's voice, synthesized but somehow real, filled the space with the same power and vulnerability it had always carried. "You made the scared immigrant kid from Zanzibar believe he could be extraordinary." Brian sat at the mixing board with tears streaming down his face, finally hearing the song he'd promised to record 30 years earlier, finally keeping his word. They called it "The Last Goodbye." Brian announced it in a carefully prepared statement that explained everything: Freddie's original composition, the guilt he'd carried, the technology that made completion possible. "For 30 years," Brian wrote, "I've lived with the knowledge that I couldn't give Freddie what he wanted most at the end of his life. This doesn't erase that failure, but it fulfills the promise I made to him, even if I'm 3 decades late." The song was released on what would have been Freddie's 75th birthday. All proceeds went to the Mercury Phoenix Trust for AIDS research, Freddie's legacy continuing to save lives even in death. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Critics debated the ethics of AI-generated performances. Fans argued about whether this honored or exploited Freddie's memory. Some called it beautiful, some called it disturbing. But those who'd known Freddie, his friends, his colleagues, the people who'd loved him, understood immediately what Brian had done. He kept his promise, Jim Hutton said in a rare interview. Freddie wanted that song to exist. Brian made sure it existed. That's love. That's loyalty. Elton John called it the most profound act of friendship I've ever witnessed in this industry. Roger Taylor said simply, "Freddie would have loved this. Not because of the technology, but because it meant Brian never stopped trying to honor him." The song itself was structured exactly as Freddie had intended. 3 verses, one for Brian, one for Roger, one for John. Then a final chorus sung together, the AI Freddie joined by the real voices of his 3 surviving bandmates. When Brian heard the complete song for the first time, all 4 voices together, synthesized and real, past and present, merging into something that transcended both, he understood something he'd been trying to learn for 30 years. Forgiveness isn't about erasing what you did wrong. It's about honoring what still could be made right. On November 24, 2021, exactly 30 years after Freddie's death, Brian returned to Garden Lodge. Mary Austin still lived there, still protecting Freddie's memory and privacy, just as he'd asked. She let Brian into the Japanese garden where he'd had that terrible conversation in 1990. The garden had grown wilder, more natural, but fundamentally unchanged. Brian brought the completed recording on a CD. He sat on the same bench where he'd sat 3 decades earlier and played it on a portable speaker, letting Freddie's voice fill the garden one more time. When the song ended, Brian pulled out a letter he'd written, not to Mary, not to the fans, but to Freddie, and he read it aloud to the autumn air. "I kept my promise. I know it took 30 years. I know you're not here to hear it properly, but I kept my promise. You were right, the song wasn't really about the recording. It was about making sure we knew what we meant to you. And we did know. We've always known. But I needed to complete it anyway. Not for you, you forgave me the day you wrote that note. But for myself. Because I needed to prove that loving someone means honoring their wishes, even when it seems impossible. You taught me that, along with everything else. How to make music that matters. How to be brave when being brave is terrifying. How to transform pain into beauty. I miss you every single day, but I don't feel guilty anymore, because I finally did what I promised. I recorded your goodbye, and it's as beautiful as you intended. Thank you for 20 years of extraordinary music and 40 years of extraordinary friendship. Thank you for showing me that art and science can dance together. Thank you for believing in a kid with a homemade guitar. The song is finished now. Your goodbye is complete. Rest well, darling. We'll keep playing your music until the world forgets how to listen. Today, The Last Goodbye is considered one of Queen's most important recordings not because of its commercial success, but because of what it represents. A promise kept, a friendship honored, a goodbye finally completed. Music schools teach it as a case study in the ethics of AI-generated art. Technologists study Maya Chen's work as a breakthrough in voice modeling. Fans debate endlessly whether it's really Freddie or something else entirely. But Brian May knows the truth. It's both. It's Freddie's words, Freddie's intention, Freddie's goodbye given voice through technology that didn't exist when he was alive. It's the past reaching forward to complete itself. And it's proof that guilt, carried long enough and transformed through love, can become something else entirely. Not redemption, Brian will never believe he deserves that, but completion. The closing of a circle that had remained open for 30 years. When Brian performs now at 77, still playing that homemade Red special, still honoring Freddie's memory, he sometimes plays The Last Goodbye as part of the encore. The AI Freddie sings through speakers while Brian's guitar weeps accompaniment, and every time he remembers that September afternoon in 1990 when he broke his friend's heart by telling him they couldn't record his final song. And every time, he's grateful that sometimes, just sometimes, you get a second chance to keep a promise. Even if it takes 30 years. Even if the person you made the promise to isn't alive to hear you keep it. Because love doesn't end when someone dies. It transforms. It adapts. It finds new ways to express itself. And sometimes, if you're lucky and stubborn and willing to carry guilt until it becomes something else entirely, you get to say the goodbye you couldn't say the first time. You get to honor the promise you thought you'd broken forever. You get to hear your best friend's voice one more time, singing the words he wrote to tell you exactly what you meant to him. Thank you for believing that a kid with a homemade guitar could help create something that mattered. Brian May kept his promise. And Freddie Mercury's final goodbye finally found its voice.